Bedtime short story World War II. What really started World War II?
September 1st, 1939, German troops thrust deep into Poland to win a swift and absolute victory. Barely 20 years earlier, their forefathers had also been on the march, but back into their homeland as a defeated army. In November 1918, after 4 years of World War I, Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been forced to abdicate. His armies were being ground down by a remorseless offensive by British, French, and U.S. troops. His people faced starvation. But already a dangerous myth was taking root. The German generals and troops claimed that they hadn't been defeated in battle, but betrayed by their own cowardly politicians, a narrative that would later be called the stab-in-the-back myth. Even so, at 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I came to an end. The following month, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Europe, promising to create a new world order. He persuaded the world's leaders to sign up to a new League of Nations, an international body aimed at preserving peace. At the Treaty of Versailles, they agreed that from now on, disputes between countries would be resolved not by fighting, but by debate in the League. The peoples of Europe were set free, and Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dismembered. Out of it, new nations were created: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was greatly reduced in size, but this process contained a time bomb. Not everyone celebrated the birth of countries like Czechoslovakia. Several of them contained substantial German minorities. One day, the desire to reunite the German peoples would come to haunt Europe. The war-torn German people also had one final indignity inflicted on them. They were forced to pay massive reparations, £6.6 billion, to France and Britain, a sum they could ill afford. And when he returned to America, Wilson's New World Order immediately fell apart. The U.S. Congress decided it could not risk being sucked into another war in Europe. It refused to join his league, and the United States withdrew into isolationism. Germany was now a very different nation. It was still Europe's biggest country, but its militaristic monarchy had gone. It had become a democracy. But its government, the so-called Weimar Republic, was soon struck by a series of hammer blows. Street battles erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists trying to start a revolution. Then in 1923, the country was devastated by hyperinflation, which reached hundreds of % a month. Ordinary people's savings were wiped out, and many middle-class families were ruined. This was fertile ground for a new breed of rabble-rousing right-wing politicians. Among them, Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born in Austria. He had fought bravely as a soldier in World War I and been awarded the Iron Cross. On returning to Germany, he settled in Munich, and his fiery oratory soon enabled him to seize control of the small National Socialist, or Nazi, party. In October 1923, Hitler and his henchmen attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government, the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed, and he was sentenced to 9 months in prison. There he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he blamed Germany's ills on the Jews and demanded that it rebuild its strength and seek new territories in the East. On his release, he set about building the Nazis into a proper, disciplined political party. From now on, he would use the democratic system to achieve power. But for the next 5 years, Weimar Germany prospered. Support for extremist parties, left and right, dwindled. Then suddenly Hitler's opportunity arrived. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Billions of dollars were lost, and an economic depression swept across the world. Unemployment in Germany soared to over 6 million. Only extremist politicians seemed to offer a solution. Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, His Nazis were a true mass movement, and they had their own brown-shirted thugs, the SA stormtroops, who numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to join a coalition, leaving parliament paralyzed. To break the impasse, President Hindenburg made him chancellor in January 1933, head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag burned down. Hitler accused the communists and demanded emergency powers. He then used them to ban all other political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler declared himself president. He was now absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. At first, there was little sign of what was to come. For the next 3 years, the Führer concentrated on rebuilding Germany's economy. He spent millions on public works, including the 5,000-mile Autobahn system, to soak up the unemployed. But in secret, Hitler was also spending lavishly on a huge rearmament program. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been limited to 100,000 men. The country was forbidden to have an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was trebled in size. Then, in 1935, Hitler came out into the open. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It had 2,500 planes, far more than Britain or France. Unemployment plunged, and the Nazis became enormously popular. Now emboldened, the Führer made his first expansionist move. In 1935, he reoccupied the Saar district on the French border after it voted to return from League of Nations to German rule. A year later, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, part of Germany which had been demilitarized at Versailles. At the time, many felt that Hitler was only claiming back what was rightfully Germany's. Neither Britain nor France objected. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis were seen by many as firm but fair, a government which was restoring the nation's pride and which didn't threaten anyone. Of course, there were signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws forbade Jews to marry true Aryan Germans and deprived them of their citizenship. But when the first threats came to world peace, they didn't come from Hitler at all, but from somewhere else entirely. Japan at the start of the 20th century was already a military power. It had defeated Russia in a war in 1905 and had fought alongside the Allies in World War I. After the war, Japan was an acknowledged world power, and it signed up to the League of Nations. But politically, it was a mess of contradictions. Nominally a democracy, the feudal tradition was still strong. Most Japanese revered their emperor as a living god and regarded him as their true leader. And the country faced major economic problems. Its population was exploding, and it had no natural resources to fuel its rapidly expanding industries. Its leaders needed solutions, and they saw them in Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a land of rich grain fields with plenty of coal and minerals. It was a perfect target. Japanese troops were already stationed there. Other possible targets were the colonies ruled by the European powers: Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong controlled by Britain, Indochina ruled by France, and the Dutch East Indies. But at this stage, Japan had to be cautious. They didn't want to rouse the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. For all its anti-imperialist slogans, the U.S. actually ran an unofficial empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several islands were under its direct rule. It undoubtedly had the strength to take on Japan, but since the end of World War I, it had had other distractions. This was America's Jazz Age. Throughout the 1920s, the nation concentrated on exploiting its vast resources. There was an economic boom that seemed without end. Fortunes were made both in industry and the stock markets. America seemed lost in the increasing pursuit of pleasure. With distractions like these, Japan's growing pains in the Pacific seemed very far away. America had slashed its army after World War I and agreed to a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. This, in effect, handed naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese. And then came the Great Depression. As the economic devastation spread, a quarter of the population lost their jobs. Tens of thousands were made homeless, living in shanty towns. Whereas before it had been distracted by pleasure, now America was distracted by pain. It was time for Japan to make her move. In 1931, without even informing their own elected government, the Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital Mukden and then overran the rest of the territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was proclaimed under a puppet ruler. Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who had been deposed in 1911, was dragged out of retirement. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first great test. Japan was universally condemned, but her response was blunt. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly. The Japanese then just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, but it didn't care. Its leaders had already turned their eyes toward further conquests in China. For them, these were easy pickings. China was in a state of deep political fragmentation. The nationalist government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was locked in a protracted conflict with the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. There was civil war, regional warlordism, and widespread instability. In 1936, as a precursor to further invasion, the Japanese signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Hitler. The aim was to coordinate against any potential Soviet move into China or Manchuria. This pact marked the early formation of what would become the Axis Alliance. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge and used it as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion. At first, the Chinese were taken by surprise, but they soon fought back fiercely. The Communists even joined the Kuomintang in a temporary united front to resist the invaders, one of the rare moments of cooperation between the two sides. The Japanese responded with amphibious landings along the Chinese coast. By the end of 1937, they had overrun much of northern China and secured key coastal cities, including Shanghai. The Japanese fought this war with exceptional brutality. Their air force bombed cities indiscriminately, targeting military positions, infrastructure, and civilian areas alike. Westerners living in the commercial center of Shanghai were evacuated as tensions rose. The city was then besieged for 3 months, suffering widespread destruction. The Japanese forces showed no pity or concern for the local population, treating surrendering soldiers and civilians with equal harshness. But it was after the capture of Nanjing, the Chinese capital, on December 17, 1937, that the Japanese forces truly ran amok. Over 300,000 civilians are estimated to have been massacred during a 6-week orgy of rape, torture, arson, and indiscriminate killing. This atrocity became known as the Rape of Nanjing, and remains one of the darkest chapters of the war. The Japanese even attacked British and American warships sent to protect international shipping and trade. The worst incident occurred on December 12, 1937, when the American gunboat Panay was sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 crewmen died. Despite this, the Western powers still refused to intervene. The League of Nations could do nothing, its authority already crumbling in the face of unchecked aggression. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade on Japan. It has become clear that acts and policies of nations in other parts of the world have far-reaching effects on us, he warned. But the British resisted, fearing such an action would provoke a major war in Asia, something neither Britain nor France was prepared for. All Roosevelt could offer was a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to purchase arms. Even though the Communists were now fighting alongside the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union did little to help. Stalin, wary of Japanese expansion into Siberia, provided only limited aircraft and advisors. Most Soviet involvement came from a series of border clashes with Japanese forces near Manchuria, culminating in the later Battle of Khalkhin Gol. China itself, however, received almost no substantial international assistance. It had to fight on alone. During 1938, the Japanese overran Canton, Guangzhou, and drove Chinese forces deeper into the west of the country. All the rhetoric from the League of Nations, all the promises to stop international aggression, had come to nothing. And by now, the Western powers were beginning to face aggression much closer to home. Today, it is easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. All his posturing seems faintly ridiculous now. But it didn't seem that way in 1922. Back then, Italy appeared to be on the edge of anarchy. The country was riven by strikes, land seizures, political violence, and economic instability. The democratic government, much like the Weimar Republic in Germany, seemed powerless in the face of such unrest. Benito Mussolini, an ambitious journalist and war veteran, decided to take a stand. He organized a right-wing nationalist movement known as the Fascists. With the country paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome.
Fearing civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini swiftly crushed political opposition and assumed dictatorial powers. His government was appointed rather than elected, and all authority was concentrated in the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler later would in Germany, Mussolini's early policies made him immensely popular. Massive public works programs reduced unemployment and modernized Italy's infrastructure. Corruption was targeted, and the mafia, although never fully eliminated, was significantly weakened. Italy's armed forces were expanded dramatically, including the development of an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini built a navy he claimed was larger than the combined British and French fleets, though much of this was propaganda. When the Great Depression struck, Italy initially weathered it better than many other nations, further enhancing Mussolini's prestige. Around the world, political leaders, including Adolf Hitler, saw the fascist system as strong, efficient, and decisive, in contrast to the seemingly paralyzed democracies of Britain and France. But Mussolini craved more than admiration. He wanted to recreate the Roman Empire, and he had already chosen his first target. His target was Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia. Italy already controlled neighboring Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. In December 1934, Italian forces provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at the oasis of Walwal, inside Abyssinian territory. Mussolini sent reinforcements to both colonies, demanding reparations from Ethiopia and preparing for invasion. The Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie, appealed in person to the League of Nations. He pleaded with it to uphold its founding principles. Here was a small nation under threat from a fellow League member. This was the ultimate test. But the League did nothing. Britain's Foreign Minister Anthony Eden attempted to broker peace, but Mussolini refused. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The Ethiopian forces, brave but poorly equipped, stood little chance. Italy deployed modern artillery, armor, and aircraft. The Italian Air Force enjoyed total control of the skies and relentlessly bombed Ethiopian positions, even using poison gas, despite its prohibition under the Geneva Protocol. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely overrun. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations wrung its hands. It imposed economic sanctions, but they were weak, incomplete, and ineffective. Mussolini's aggression revealed two harsh truths. The League of Nations, the great hope for peace, was powerless. Europe's major democracies, Britain and France, no longer had the will to fight a distant war.
Both nations had been shattered by World War I. Their economies had never fully recovered. Both had seen massive unemployment and waves of political unrest. Both also faced the financial burden of managing vast empires, swollen with former German and Ottoman territories. And above all, both were traumatized by the horrific casualties of the First World War. A succession of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and above all, Stanley Baldwin, were determined to avoid another conflict at almost any cost. Britain had ended World War I with a large, effective conscript army. But this force was immediately downsized to a small professional army focused on imperial policing. When the Great Depression struck, plans to modernize the military were shelved. France had suffered even heavier losses than Britain. Distrustful of Germany, it maintained a large conscript army, but declining birth rates throughout the 1920s meant that manpower would soon become a serious problem. France realized it could never match Germany in brute numbers. The solution was to build a formidable defensive barrier. The Maginot Line, a vast system of fortifications, was begun in 1930. It stretched along the German border and theoretically connected with Belgian defenses to the north. This defensive mindset meant that France was prepared only for a defensive war. It had neither the political will nor the military capacity to launch an offensive against Italy, even if Britain had been willing to help. Meanwhile, both nations knew that their Mediterranean fleets were now outmatched by Mussolini's expanded navy. So when Italy conquered Abyssinia, both Britain and France chose to look away. The crisis seemed remote, someone else's problem. And at home, the economic crisis and unemployment seemed far more urgent. Above all, both powers now faced a much more immediate threat, a resurgent, rearming Germany under Adolf Hitler. And Germany's new strength, as well as Italy's, would soon be demonstrated in support of another dictator rising in Spain. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain. It was exceptionally vicious, pitting families against one another, communists against fascists.
In 1931, a left-wing government had come to power, determined to abolish Spain's centuries-old monarchy. King Alfonso XIII fled into exile, and the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. In February 1936, the parties of the left formed a Popular Front coalition to confront the parties of the right in a general election. The Popular Front won narrowly. Even though its reform program was modest, a wave of strikes and land seizures led the right to fear that a communist takeover was inevitable. Within the Spanish army, long a bastion of conservative and Catholic thinking, senior officers began to consider the possibility of a coup. Among them was General Francisco Franco, the former chief of staff who had been effectively exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, units of the army fighting guerrillas in Spain's colony in Morocco mutinied. The next day, Franco flew to join them, proclaiming a new nationalist movement which would save Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons now joined the revolt. The Popular Front responded by calling for volunteers to defend the Republic. Battle lines had been drawn. At first, Franco faced problems. He and his army were in North Africa, and he had to get across the Strait of Gibraltar back to Spain. So he turned to the one person he thought might help, Adolf Hitler. Within a month, transport aircraft from Hitler's new Luftwaffe had begun an airlift, taking Franco's battle-hardened veterans over to southern Spain. At this stage, the Republic still seemed to have the advantage. The pro-Franco military uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were quickly crushed, leaving it in control of most of the east of the country. Franco's nationalists were confined largely to the northwest and part of the south. But the nationalist situation was transformed when Hitler and Mussolini started to pour in troops and weapons. The German dictator seized the opportunity to test his new equipment and expanding armed forces. The first panzer tanks were sent, along with some 12,000 troops.
and the Luftwaffe deployed its Condor Legion with its ultra-modern new bombers and fighters. Mussolini sent a so-called volunteer corps of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. In vain did the Republicans appeal to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help. But London and Paris were scared of setting off a European war. They declared a policy of non-intervention. Cynically, both Germany and Italy signed up to this. But when it became obvious that they were still sending arms to the nationalists, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, announced that he would help the Republic. Stalin's worry was the rise of fascism in Germany. Hitler had made it abundantly clear that he believed communism to be Nazism's ultimate enemy. Stalin saw the Spanish conflict as a way of keeping Germany and Italy occupied while building up the Soviet Union's military strength. About 700 military advisors were sent, along with tanks and fighter aircraft. It was something, but no match for the support Franco had received. In fact, the largest source of outside help for the Republic didn't come from a country at all, but from volunteers, the international brigades. About 30,000 left-wing Americans, British, French, and Germans signed up to fight in Spain. With their new fascist support, the nationalists were able to open two fronts, one advancing toward Barcelona from the north, the other led by Franco pushing up toward Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid was enveloped on three sides and virtually under siege. The fighting was intense and often accompanied by appalling atrocities against civilians. The Republicans hunted down and murdered Roman Catholic priests. The nationalists slaughtered anyone accused of being a communist. German and Italian air power was used indiscriminately against civilian targets. Madrid was heavily bombed. But the worst incident came in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was virtually obliterated, with some 6,000 civilian deaths. The area controlled by the Republic was steadily ground down. Its forces fought with great gallantry, but undertrained and under-equipped amateurs were no match for the professional soldiers led by Franco, or for the combined modern weaponry of Italy and Germany. As the war dragged on, the fighting around Madrid became a symbol of the left's determination not to be crushed by a fascist dictatorship. But behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was falling apart. The communists and socialists wanted to concentrate on winning a military victory, but the more idealistic anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as an opportunity for a mass revolution by the workers. These disagreements burst out into the open in May 1937. Fighting broke out in Barcelona between the anarchists and communists. It was a fatal weakening of the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had penned their enemy into a small enclave around Barcelona and another stretching eastward from Madrid to the coast. Madrid continued to hold out, but the international brigades were withdrawn. More and more nations began to recognize Franco's government as his forces closed in for the final assault on Madrid. At the end of March 1939, its defenders, exhausted after nearly 3 years of fighting, the capital finally surrendered. A month later, Franco formally declared hostilities at an end. The scars of Spain's civil war took years to heal, and in some ways they never have. And internationally, Franco's victory over the Republic proved a disaster. Hitler and Mussolini were confirmed in their belief that the democracies of Britain and France were impotent to resist any real pressure. While Stalin despaired of their willingness to confront fascism, Hitler in particular saw his way open to begin the aggressive policies outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were on the march. From the moment he became Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, Hitler had begun to put his long-term ambitions into action. On February 3rd, he told his top commanders that his ultimate aim was to conquer territory in the east and ruthlessly Germanize it. They were instructed to prepare for a massive expansion. Although Germany had been forbidden tanks, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 had allowed the development of tank designs and experimentation with new mobile armored tactics. Energetic young German officers like Heinz Guderian read the theories of British thinkers like Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They even watched exercises being carried out by the British during the 1920s on Salisbury Plain. It was from these that they came up with the idea of fast-moving units combining tanks, artillery, and infantry that could thrust fast and deep into enemy territory. Hitler adopted their ideas with enthusiasm. The new army was to have 3 panzer divisions. Similarly, the new Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under former World War I fighter ace Hermann Göring, had a framework to build on. Throughout the years in which its Air Force was officially banned, Germany had kept up its design skills by building civilian machines, and gliding and flying clubs provided a reserve of potential airmen. Hitler revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935. He then announced that the army was to be increased to 300,000 men and conscription was reintroduced. Britain and France protested feebly at this flagrant breach of the Versailles Treaty, but soon they reluctantly and slowly began to rearm. Until this point, Hitler had been modest in his goals. He had only taken back what was his, the Rhineland and the Tsar. But now he had a grander target in mind, his homeland, Austria. In 1934, Austrian Nazis had attempted to seize power and unify the country with Germany. The Austrians, after all, spoke German, even if they had never been part of a German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was discovered. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg protested to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop mistreating the Austrian Nazis and unite with Germany. Schuschnigg announced a referendum so that the Austrians could vote on whether to remain independent. But on March 12, 1938, the eve of the referendum, Hitler, fearing that it might produce the wrong result, sent in his troops. Complete surprise and an enthusiastic welcome by Nazi sympathizers made it a bloodless invasion. Within hours, Hitler announced Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich. A sovereign nation had for the first time been subsumed into a greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to react.